When I was a little kid, I wanted to be some kind of a soldier, some kind of a commando. And I realized that there was guys that were fighting and dying and I wasn't with them. And so I immediately figured out how to get in. I heard that the SEALs was a tough organization and hard to get through, and that made me want to do it. It was just one of those things that I was, I had inside I guess inside my head or soul or whatever, for lack of a better word. It's what I always wanted to do since I could remember wanting to do anything.
Jocko was a task unit commander. He was an intimidating guy. I never saw that man sleep. I remember anytime I woke up in the morning, he was already up. I went to bed at night, he was still up.
If Ramadi would have fallen, you would have a very secure area for the insurgency to grow. You can't have it fall to the enemy. That's all there is to it.
Guys, thank you so much for being here. Congratulations on this incredible project. Peter, I imagine that this started with Lone Survivor. I could be wrong, but I mean, when I saw Lone Survivor, one of the things that was most clear to me was how much you felt for this true story and for the men who lived stories like that. It was palpable right from the beginning of the film that you almost wanted to make a documentary about these guys when you were there.
Yeah, and when I met Ray, who's a good friend of Marcus Luttrell, who is obviously the focal point of Lone Survivor, and Ray was one of the consultants on the film. Ray was a Navy SEAL, and actually we was still in the SEALs at the time we did Lone Survivor, and Ray and a bunch of his colleagues were with me the whole time that we were filming Lone Survivor, making sure that we all got it as accurately as we could. And by the time Lone Survivor was done, I had gotten to know so many folks in the special operations community, and I realized that as compelling a story as Lone Survivor was, Lone Survivor is just one of hundreds of stories. And the reality of the war that we've been fighting for so long is that there aren't these big giant battles like there were in World War II. There wasn't the Tet Offensive like there was in Vietnam. The reality is these wars have been populated by these small conflicts where 2 or 3 people were killed or injured, or an IED went off, and all of these stories were very compelling, and we wanted to figure out a way to tell more of them.
We're telling these stories, and telling these stories, like you said, you're not just telling the story of big battles. It's there. We're in the town of Ramadi. We're talking about it. But I'm curious, you sort of bring up a question that I'm interested in. When you are there, does it not feel like you are a part of battles? Does it feel like you are kind of living day-to-day mini battles, or sort of living within a battle?
Absolutely. I mean, it's once you get there, it takes, you got to acclimate. You have an op tempo, which is the rate in which you conduct operations. But yeah, I mean, in a place like Ramadi where you hit the ground running, you very much get kind of snapped into what you get a quick realization that, all right, this is real. You can die, your friends can die. So yeah, very quickly, in a place like Ramadi, with such a high tempo and the kind of the epicenter of the insurgency, yep, you come to it pretty fast.
Peter, when it goes into telling these stories, I think on television, when we see war stories, when we see people recollecting things that have happened to them in the past, we have a lot of reenactments. And this doesn't necessarily have reenactments that I think we normally see. How did you approach the filmmaking behind visualizing these stories?
Well, I mean, we had discussed creating a show that was maybe equal parts interviews where the guys were actually just telling the stories, real footage, and from the battles or from the events that we were telling the story about, and then a certain amount of recreation. And I think that we all sort of, collectively watched these interviews. And one of the great things about having 2 special operations partners who were, really creatively responsible for so much of this was that they were able to get men who normally just wouldn't talk. These guys are very private, they're very close-lipped, and if you or I were trying to get them to open up, they wouldn't, but because it was their fellow brothers asking the questions, they talked. And we pretty quickly felt that the most compelling part of the show wasn't the reenactments, but it was quite simply looking into the eyes of some of the bravest, most badass human beings I've ever encountered in my life, and listening to them let their guards down and become very vulnerable and very honest. And so the recreation aspect of the show kind of fell away, and we played it as real as we could, and those were the interviews.
Well, what made you comfortable about working with Peter and working with this team to sort of talk to your brothers, to sort of get them to open up? Because I would imagine you wouldn't necessarily do that for anybody. You want to be as protective of their stories as they are.
Yeah, really it was through my relationship with Ray, who I had served with prior to getting out of the military. And based on our past experience together, that completely, I trust Ray, and through Ray trusts Pete. And so your reputation goes a long way in this community. In fact, based on that, that's how Ray and I got guys to come up and share their stories. If I didn't have that entire career of setting up that reputation, it wouldn't be there. But that simple as that, it's just a basic trust, which is required to do something like this.
Ray, how did Peter develop a trust with you while doing Lone Survivor that made you comfortable going into this project and bringing other men along into it?
Yeah, I mean, I got brought into Lone Survivor because of Marcus Luttrell. We served together, we're good friends, and that was just kind of my task. Obviously, by default, I had to work with Pete, and we had to come to common ground on, making sure, my sole purpose was just to train and make sure the cast looked, talked, walked like we would. So I think just in that process, hearing his vision and what he wanted to do with the film kind of was in line with what we all thought it should be as well.
There was also a weekly meeting between the two of us where Ray would just calmly and quietly remind me that if I fucked up the movie in any way, I would be killed. And there was no smiles or joking or nothing like that. It was just, we will kill you.
Yeah, it was usually on like a napkin. I would pass. It was never
Quiet
verbal.
threat.
But yeah.
And so that's how we sort of seared our friendship, was through threats of death.
I think one of the great aspects about Live to Tell, and we kind of already touched upon this, was that it doesn't focus on the reenactments, and it focuses, as you said, on these men's faces telling these stories, because these are, for lack of a better word, thrilling stories. They are stories that feature danger and heroism in some way, but not having the reenactments helps you focus on these. These were real men in the midst of a somewhat desperate and crazy situation at a time, and not saying everybody's a hero and this is what we're doing. It reflects a certain amount of reality. Was that something that you were thinking about going into making this as well?
Yeah, I mean, one of the privileges, the great privileges of my career has been getting to know Navy SEALs and Army Rangers and Delta Force guys and all these special operations men and women who, at first glance are almost like superhuman. They're superheroes. And they're willing to do things for us that are almost unimaginable. And I was able to get, access to those people and to be able to see through the superhero persona into a much more vulnerable human side. And I found that, I was fortunate to be able to go to Iraq for a month and embed with the Navy SEAL platoon. And
when did you do that? I'm sorry, I didn't know that.
I did that about 2.5 years ago.
You were there for a month?
Yes, I was there for a month in a town that's now completely overrun by ISIS. It's an area right on the Syrian border. And, people have asked me, well, what was that like? It must have been scary, and, you must have seen a lot of really, intense things. And, I maybe did see some intense things, but what I usually say is I've never laughed so hard, and I actually never had more fun. I never met a greater group of guys who had a bond and a love for each other and a sense of humor that was, on a level that I rarely encounter. And I was able to see these guys in a very complex and multidimensional way that transcended the kind of tough persona that we associate with them, and that we were able to put a lot of that in the film and let the guys who were being interviewed, guys like Jocko, who you see in the first show, who's one of the toughest, scariest, most intimidating human beings I've ever met, but you see him in this show in a very emotional light. And so I'm very happy that we were able to present the guys in that way.
One of the things that the show definitely presents is the bond that you're talking about. I think someone's mother in it, or excuse me, or I think it was his mother says, he said that he's as close to these people as he is his brother. And I was like, you got these guys that you just met. Can you talk about depicting that bond and where that bond comes from? It doesn't just come from training together, but I imagine it comes from the situation at hand, a certain sort of catharsis that comes with, as Peter said, laughing so hard and also feeling so much for the people that you're with.
Yeah, I think that job. It's not, you can't simply describe it as a job. It becomes your entire life. You spend years with the same guys in a platoon, and it's not always these crazy, life-threatening situations. It's just the day-to-day activities, but you're doing it with these guys that you have this very unique experience with, and that's where that bond comes with. You have mutual suffering, mutual good time. Everything you celebrate is together. And the weird thing is, it's a bunch of people that you never would have met if you hadn't joined the military, that you never would have had these experiences. Maybe you get into school or whatever, but to me, that's one of the special things, is that shared experience that really nobody else is going to have. But it's important with the show to share that connection and to show everyone out there that this is happening, and that gap between civilian and guys like this, we can share this, and we can get it out there for everyone to see.
It's one of the great parts about doing the show for you guys, being able to maintain that bond, being able to go back and help with these interviews and work with these guys and see them again.
Yeah, it was. I mean, in a lot of sense, they were like little reunions. We did 8 episodes, essentially 8 reunions, because these guys, they're all from different states, different parts of the country. So some of the guys hadn't seen each other in years, and they come together and they each tell their own portion of the story, and they start, recalling and remembering, like, oh yeah, I remember that. Like, oh man, I totally forgot about that. So it's cool to see that, see them come together, and let's just start talking about old times.
And you have this weird friendship between Rangers and SEALs that is usually doesn't exist. Really, you have that sibling or inter-service rivalry, and then
The Rangers and SEALs have a rivalry?
Oh, no,
Absolutely.
not at all. But it's kind of unique even in that aspect.
Peter, I don't mean to trivialize anything, but so often making a film, for a lot of people, they describe it as a kind of war, and a brotherhood develops on the course of the set. It's silly. I apologize for saying that in front of these men who've been there. But is that something that in some ways sort of drew you to this, or helped you connect to it in some way?
I wouldn't. I don't think so. I mean, I think I do feel that the reverse may be true a bit more, though. That I've, one of the things that I've, had really thrust kind of into the forefront of my attention is the complexities that these guys, particularly the special operations soldiers, the complexities of readjusting from the life that they're talking about, from that brotherhood, from this kind of life that we all can't imagine, where you in many ways get to play God. You're living with a group of your peers, you're in a foreign country, you've got the license to, under many circumstances, to go do your job, and if somebody becomes in between you and your job, you've got the license to kill, and that's your job. And that is obviously a pretty intense and heady experience, a place to be. And when we ask these men and women to come home and sort of hang up their guns and sit in traffic and get flipped off by 17-year-old kids driving their parents' Range Rovers, the readjustment is not necessarily the most easy and fluid experience. And so something I've tried to do and get involved with is kind of figure out well, how can we help? How can we all what can we do to help veterans who've done so much for us, re-enter society? And one thing that has sort of occurred to me, that in a completely different, set of risk and much lower on the intensity level, but a film crew and a film set is actually a somewhat logical transition for someone that's served in the military and has experienced 6-month deployments and is used to working on a certain project with a group of people and so on and so forth. So we've tried to, find the similarities between military deployment and film crew work, and there are certain similarities, and it gives me and the people I work with great joy when we see guys who have been able to serve and function in that special operations community assimilate into our business, and I think it can be a very good transition. But what we do compared to what they do, you just can't compare the two.
So, I mean, that's incredible, though. Have you developed like a program? I mean, outside of just creating this show where these guys can work together and work with each other, are you developing a program or
I'm not big on programs, because then I think you get bureaucracy and a bunch of people, but we just try and hire as many veterans as we can. And, when we meet guys like Ray and Mike who, are out and who are showing the gumption to come at us and say, look, here's our idea and this is what we want to do. And we're not, it ain't charity. They've come to us with a great idea. They've done 99% of the hard work, and if we can help them and facilitate them, and this can be a part of a transition from an incredibly intense lifestyle that they both lived into a new life, we're very happy. So I and the people of my company kind of take it literally one vet at a time. Anyone that comes to us, we're open to.
Did it feel like this was a helpful transition for you working on this project?
Absolutely, it's a kind of a creative outlet for us. I mean, we come from a job doing the work that we do, and where do you apply that skill set? You can go contract overseas, or maybe be a cop. But in this industry, doing these types of shows, it's a creative outlet. I can take essentially what I know and apply it into another career field, essentially. So it allows me to problem solve, and it's great because it's very fast-paced, kind of on set sometimes, and it's kind of like the world we live in. It's controlled chaos sometimes. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Prior to working on the show, I was just going to school for archaeology, which I left school to work on the show full time, which is because it's that important. But I didn't really realize what he just said is absolutely true. That set that is you have this chaos, and every day is a new problem to solve, and that really appeals to, I think, guys from this background.
Absolutely. I think you have some time for audience questions. Does anyone have any questions out here in the audience?
Good afternoon. My name is Ernest Robinson. I've become a director. Love your work. I just want to know, going from Hancock to this, mentally as a director, how do you do it? And then how do you all transition from, as you said, organized chaos into sort of a creative outlet? My older brother is actually a pilot out of Andrews. So just to hear his stuff, how do you as a director go from doing that to that? Then how do you transition from this is sort of organized chaos to telling us, a story?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I believe that if you're fortunate enough to be a film director, and I consider myself very fortunate, you have to have a real love of that game. You got to wake up every day and be like, holy shit, I get to make movies. This is the job I get to do, and I get to travel around in these different worlds and meet all these different kinds of people, and it's a very, very privileged life, and you got to get excited and fall in love with pretty much everything that you do. And so if it's I directed a car commercial for the Super Bowl last week, and man, I fucking love that car. I love that Hyundai so much, and Kevin Hart was in the commercial, and I love working with Kevin Hart, and that's got to be a legitimate passion. And when I was doing Hancock, the idea of Will Smith as an alcoholic superhero, I mean, that was fun, and I was in love with it, and Will was an inspirational guy, and I fell in love with that. And when in the case of some of the other films like Friday Night Lights or The Kingdom, those are a bit different. Those are a bit more emotional, and I will say that with Lone Survivor, that hit another level. And I do believe that like movies or you're like children, you got to love them all. But as I said to my son, I said, look, I'll love you forever, but if you get an A, I'm gonna love you just a little bit more, right? So it's possible, to love some a little bit more. I do love this and these guys a little bit more maybe than the other ones, but you got to love them all.
No, it's a good question, and I think every vet that gets out, they have to learn, one, to truly separate from the military, and that is to realize that they have to move on. At some point, you have to move forward with your life, because you really can't just live always looking behind you at the last thing you did, right? I encourage guys to look at what they did in the military as not the only great thing they'll ever do, but to look at it as a stepping stone to the next great thing. But it takes a while. It takes a lot of struggle to move on from that. It's hard. You really have to find a purpose or something to do to redefine yourself and really find that next great thing you're going to do.
Did you guys struggle a little bit to move on when you got out?
I definitely did personally. It takes time, and to process all the things, and to again, like, you from one day you're an Army Ranger or whatever, and the next day you're just another kid at school, surrounded by a bunch of people that know very little about you, have very little common ground other than the fact that you're both in the classroom at the same time. So it definitely takes some time and effort.
I think we are wrapping it up. Guys, congratulations so much on this show. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.